Hey everybody, I'm Chad with Cosplay Armor and Props, and you might recognize the guy behind me as Ornstein from Dark Souls. So when I first played this game, I saw this character. It was the most impressive armor I'd ever seen, so I figured I had to make it. And I started this project in the beginning of 2014, so it's been going for a while. So I want to show you a little bit about what I've done with this armor. But first, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about using magnets in your costume armor. I'm sure a lot of you have used them before, but you've probably been in a situation where you wanted to use them, but you were afraid your piece was going to fall off, so you chose some other method like Velcro or buckles or straps or something. So I just want to give you a little tip that might make you revisit some of these options for magnets, because they're pretty useful. I've got about let's see, I made a note here. I've got, so far in this armor, including the spear I'm working on, I've got 32 magnetic connection points, and I think a total of about 73 individual magnets in this costume so far. So there'll probably be a few more before I'm done, but yeah, I use a lot of magnets. So I'm gonna. This armor is made from Sintra, which is an expanded PVC sheet. Looks like this stuff here. So it's a rigid plastic. You know, it's nice and smooth. It's fairly rigid, but I mean it is flexible somewhat. You can see, and it can be heat formed with a heat gun or in the oven. I just use a heat gun. You do want to make sure you use a respirator when you're heating this stuff up, because it gives off noxious fumes. So comes in a lot of thicknesses. This is the 3mm, which is basically 1/8 of an inch. I use this. This is probably the one I've used the most. With a sheet like this, you know, it's fairly rigid, it's fairly stiff, but it still flexes somewhat. When you get it into a thinner piece like this one, you know, it's quite flexible. But if you do bend it too far, you know, when it's cold, it will snap or crease and fold over, and then it's kind of wrecked. I also use the 6mm. This is probably the one I prefer to work with, although it is a little heavier. It's stiffer, but it's just easier to shape. It holds its curves a lot nicer than the 1/8 inch stuff. Same thing with this in a thinner strip. You know, this stuff will flex quite a bit. So it's pretty strong stuff, and it's easy to finish. I mean, it's as soon as you're done, you know, you don't even need a whole lot of sanding. It's ready for paint, unlike Warbler and foam and some of the other materials. And then it also comes in 12mm, which is 1/2 inch. It doesn't really flex. It's pretty strong. I mean, if you get a thin strip, it'll bend somewhat, but it's quite solid, you know. And you can see back here, I've used that here in the top of the tassets and up here in the neck guards on the pauldrons. And you can heat form it, but you got to be really patient. It takes a long time to heat it up enough to where it'll bend. But once, you know, it's probably like 5 minutes with the heat gun to get it to start bending. But once it's heated up, it bends real easily, and then as soon as you take the heat off, it stops and stays right where you put it. So it's pretty nice to work with. So anyway, back to magnets. So I'm going to tip the camera down here and show you a little bit about what I'm talking about. Let's see if this works here. Okay. So hopefully that's still in focus. So the magnets I'm talking about are the, you know, commonly referred to as rare earth magnets or neodymium magnets. They're usually silver in color, and for their size, they're extremely strong. You know, these are probably the two most common sizes I use. These are 1/2 inch in diameter and either 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch thick. And when you stick them together, you can see that little guy's moving around just, you know, from this far away. So when you stick these guys together, you know, they're quite strong, hard to pull apart. But they also come, you know, in various shapes and sizes. These three have holes in them, so you can put a screw through them give you, or a small like a bolt and nut to give you even more security. And then you can also stack these together and get, you know, if you stack them together, it's not quite the equivalent of, you know, the sum of the magnet's power added together, but it's pretty darn close. So the more you stack them together, the stronger the magnetic force becomes. And then depending on what you're doing with your armor, you can use, you know, really big ones. I saw a guy that he had a sword and he was just like sticking it to his back, you know, with magnets, and that was his sheath. So pretty strong stuff. I'm going to stick these guys together, and then you do got to be careful, especially these little tiny ones. They are kind of brittle. I don't know if you can see here that that little one just broke and disintegrated, so it's kind of toast. They also come in much bigger sizes. Hopefully you don't need to use something like this, but this is what the size was the guy had on his sword, and you know, it's enormous. If you do use these kind, you do need to be careful because they are, you know, very strong. Whoa. They can draw blood when, you know, they can pinch you so hard. So do be careful with those. So anyway, back to the ones I'm going to show you on the armor. So I've got some pieces of Sintra over here. I'm going to grab them in a second, but I've got basically this 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch installed on one piece, and I've got this 1/2 inch by 1/8 inch installed on some other pieces. So, you know, when you're sticking them together with your hands and trying to pull them apart, yeah, it's quite tough to pull them apart. So you think, wow, that's really strong. But if you hook this to a big piece of your costume armor and you stick it to your body, well, it doesn't take as much force as you think to separate those again, because, you know, there's a bigger surface area. If it gets bumped by something, you know, it'll come off of there, and you don't want that to happen. So grab these pieces. So here I've got the one magnet, and I've got another one here, and these are just super glued down to the Sintra. And when you stick these together, you know, pretty strong bond. If I go to pull that apart, let's see if I can focus the camera. You know, it takes a fair amount of force to pull that apart, right? Which is great, but that's not always the way the force is applied, right? So if you're sticking this onto your body and it's a piece of armor that attaches like this, well, that's great if, you know, it's not going to get bumped in this direction to pull off. It's going to get bumped and it's going to go down, it's going to go up, you know, or to the side, and when you pull this thing to the side, you know, as you know, the amount of force that it takes to pull that off is a whole lot less than it is pulling it straight off. So that's a problem, and I think a lot of people don't use magnets in certain situations just because of that problem. So there's a simple solution, and looks like this, right? So basically, you recess the magnet, and the other one's protruding. So as soon as that makes connection, right, there's no way this is going to slide off anymore. Absolutely cannot. You'd have to break that super glue bond before it's going to come off to the side, which is going to be, you know, 10 times as strong as pulling the magnet out, you know, in its strong direction. So once you have that, you know, it's a very secure fit. It doesn't really matter which orientation. You know, this can be on the top of your helmet, it can be on the side of your, you know, your shoulder. It doesn't matter. It's once it's on there, you know, it's going to take force in one direction only to get that thing back off. So it's going to hold pretty darn well. Now, there might be some cases where you have to use a bigger magnet, and that's, you know, it actually takes a lot of effort to pull it apart this way, which may not be practical. You know, your piece might be too fragile to exert that kind of force on it without damaging the paint or the finish or the LED lighting or what have you. So in that case, you can just make an easy modification to this design by doing this, right? Can you see that? So it's just basically a socket. So you can attach it straight on. It can pull straight off, but it can also slide out in one direction only. All right, so you'll see when I get to the Ornstein Armor that this is the method I utilized for the Pauldrons, and it secures pretty well. And the Pauldrons are big, you know, they're heavy. They're about 2.5 pounds each. So hopefully, you know, maybe this is something you didn't think of before, and this is helpful to you. Or, you know, maybe you already knew this, but if you did, you know, did you tell anybody? Because I looked on YouTube for magnets and armor and cosplay and costumes, and there's not much out there. So anyway, that's what I wanted to show, and then we'll come back to the Ornstein Armor here. But I'm going to have to switch to my other camera for that, so I'll be right back with you. Okay, so on to the tour. I've got them pretty well taken apart. So let's start with the lower body here. So the kilt is real chainmail. I made that from aluminum links, so it'd be a little bit lighter. It's still fairly heavy. Not a whole lot of fun to make either. Very time consuming and monotonous work. The tassets, actually first, so the chainmail is all attached to this belt, and I've got suspenders to distribute the weight to my shoulders. And then the tassets are hung from the belt, from the belt with the stainless steel chains, just like it shows in the game. And then each of these pieces are individually attached to the one above, as you can see, by small links of chain or rings. Except this section here is one piece. That way, so you know, as you walk, it's all going to move and clack around just like it does in the game. And then these chains are all attached, bolted through this piece on the back side of this, which is attached by magnets, of course. So each one of these is one of the chains, and then there's 3 magnets on each side here. So it's the first place I use magnets. Alright, so next piece is the torso. So the torso armor is one piece, and this is not the most practical, I gotta admit, but it works. It's kind of hard to get on and off, but I can do it. I can do it solo, so that was part of my requirements for building this, is I need to be able to take it off and put it on by myself. So it also barely fits on my mannequin, but it does fit, just barely. So put that on there. And then I need this little foam block because the helm doesn't fit quite right on his little pinhead. So the pauldrons, actually let me do the chest plate first. So the chest plate mounts with magnets as well. You can see here I got this post, and there's a bolt sticking through there, and then there's a corresponding socket on this side, and then magnets underneath it attach it in place. And I've got magnets on the sides of it, you know, attached here. And I thought that was going to be sufficient. The problem I ran into is that if I take a deep breath and stick my gut out a little bit, if it pushes on the bottom, it'll slide those side magnets right off, and then the front one will pop off, and the whole thing will just fall off. So that was a problem. So to solve that, instead of doing sockets, I did kind of a variation, but basically I added these little blocks, glued on little rectangular pieces here, and then on the sides I cut slots that correspond to those. So once this thing goes on, it's actually a little snug on my mannequin, so I have to push here, but those will drop into those sockets there on each side. And now the thing's on there, it's not going anywhere. So the only way to get it off is to pry up on the sides a little bit, and then it comes right off. So onto the pauldrons. So as I mentioned, these are about pretty close to 2.5 pounds a piece, you know, because it's all 1/4 inch cintra except for the neck guard, which is all 1/2 inch. So there's quite a lot of plastic here. And then on the inside here, there's I don't know what you call these things, but there's some posts And I don't even need to put the screws in them because once I got them on there, there's no way they're coming off without a lot of force. So this allows this piece to pivot here. And I've got an adjustable stop as to how far it drops down or stays up. And then you can see the magnets here, right? So there's actually a stack of 3 on the front and a stack of 4 in the back that are held in place with a bolt. And on the other side of the bolt, I filled in with epoxy putty so you don't see the head of the bolt at all. And then those mount on these. There's one on the front, one on the back for each side, using the sockets. So basically, once these things go into place, since there's a front and a back, and this is all rigid, once that's on there, the only way it's coming out is up through the slot. So get this guy on there. Alright, so once that's on there, it's on there. It's not going anywhere. And then it can also pivot on the magnets. So it pivots here, so I can raise my arms pretty much, parallel to the ground from the sides. Get this other one on. Trying to do this part by myself is the trickiest part, trying to line up that back magnet without being able to see it at all. But I won't miss it. Alright, so those are on there. And the badges, of course, attach with magnets. You can see them all stacked up across the front of here, and they just go on like so. Easy as you please. Getting those all lined up was a bit of a chore. Alright, so last but not least is the helm. I'm actually working on redoing the bottom part of this, so it's not completely finished yet. I still need to do some more paint and then weather it. I'm going to go ahead and put it on first, and then I'll talk through it. Alright, so those familiar with the character should know that he actually, he looks through the mouth, not the eyes in the game. So the mouth slot is the visor. And as you can imagine, it's kind of hard to see through there. It's a very, small space blocked by a bunch of teeth. I actually lined up the teeth in relation to where my eyes would be, so I'd have more of a view, but it's still very hard to see. When I first wore this thing out on some uneven ground, it was quite scary. So I did make this piece removable, so I could take it off to eat and drink. But I decided that I also needed to have a visor open position so that I could open the visor and lock it into place, and then I could walk around without fear of falling and be able to navigate stairs and whatnot, or it just comes off completely. So just this piece, this has magnet, lots of magnets in this, like I mentioned. Let's see what else. Inside here, there's a fan that is pointed to blow on my face, and it runs off a little USB battery stick. It'll run for about 12 hours on one charge. And then this piece is also removable here. If you can see underneath, there's actually it started out as a rock climbing helmet underneath there, and then I built everything onto it. And then I can also access the mounts for the fan to replace it if I need to. And I can actually take the whole thing apart and get that helmet out of there and replace that if needed as well. Last is the plume. So this has probably been the biggest challenge of this costume, was coming up with something to make the plume look like it does in the game. I finally came up with this. These are basically wool dreadlocks. I had to make them individually using a wet felting method, which it's a bit of a learning curve. Wasn't a whole lot of fun to do. And you basically start out with just raw wool. It's it just kind of looks like this stuff, and then you have to turn it into dreadlocks. It is a bit heavy, so this whole plume, there's like 15 locks on here. This thing weighs about 1.5 pounds by itself, which doesn't seem like a huge amount, but when you hang it out, like out here, away from your center of balance, it's quite noticeable. I actually had to make a counterweight that's mounted inside the front of the neck, some fishing weights encased inside some epoxy putty, and then that hangs on there, and there's a magnet to hold that in place as well. So that's pretty much it. The only other thing is the way I attached all this cincture together was with super glue. This one specifically, I tried lots of different kinds, and this one by far works the best. The Loctite Professional Super Glue. Also use Accelerator so that it activates the super glue immediately, so you don't have to wait there for however long to hold the pieces together. And then for the most part, all the detail work, all this stuff was done with epoxy putty. I use the Magic Sculpt brand. It's real similar to epoxy sculpt. I prefer this one. I think it works a little bit nicer. But that's about it. Hope you enjoyed my video. If you liked it, please give a like. And hopefully I'll be back to make some more. Thank you.